Yes, you may be wondering, how can you have a roundtable with just 2 participants? Well, the answer is you can if it's organized by the CIUS. And the reason you can is because the precedent has already been set in Ukrainian politics. You may recall that then President, and he still thinks he is, Viktor Yanukovych, had a roundtable with the political opposition, but there was just him and them on 2 sides of a rectangular table. So the precedent has been set, and we can indeed have a roundtable, even though there's only 2. There's a bit of a dilemma here at the start. I had proposed that I could give some introductory remarks to kind of lay the groundwork for the discussion to come, but half of our panel told me, no, you don't have to do that, and the other half said, yes, you should do that. Well, so naturally I instantly found the correct solution, which was to cut my remarks in half. So I have these prepared remarks here, and half of 50 minutes is only 25 minutes. No, seriously. As you know about the crisis in Ukraine, in defiance of international law, Russia has taken over Crimea, expelling Ukrainian forces from their bases and blocking access to those bases, blocking access to the provincial parliament and to border crossings. This intervention by unidentified armed soldiers in crisp new Russian uniforms was followed by the installation of a new pro-Russian premier in that oblast, whose party had actually only gained about 4% of the vote in the preceding elections. But in any case, he became premier, and the parliament under his leadership voted in favor of secession, and then that culminated in a referendum that obtained a rather unbelievable 97% approval. Following that, the Russian Duma recognized the referendum's results and adopted very quickly the requisite law, and President Vladimir Putin endorsed Crimea's annexation into the Russian Federation on Friday, the 21st of March. This all started, just to review, last November, when Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych abruptly reversed course by announcing the postponement to his signing of an association agreement with the European Union on the very eve of the EU summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. Instead, he sought and obtained the promise of a $15 billion loan from Russian President Putin. Now, a large number of people in Kyiv, dismayed and shocked by this about-face, assembled in the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which is the Ukrainian capital's main square, to protest the abrupt shutdown of what many felt were their dreams of European integration and of the country's dream of European association and integration. Now, when these protesters, mainly students, were forcefully dispersed, they were then replaced by more demonstrators. In other words, their dispersal did not discourage them, but rather encouraged the demonstrations and the protests. And then at that point, the protests target shifted from concerns about future ties with the EU to the broader matters of general dissatisfaction with President Yanukovych, with the corruption and criminality of his government, its dissatisfaction with its economic, social policies, and outrage at the injustices borne by the average Ukrainian citizen since independence in 1991. So thousands of people then occupied the square, barricading themselves within a considerable area of central Kyiv, and they were kept supplied and augmented by their fellow citizens, not only from Kyiv, but from all parts of the country. That occupation continued for months, despite attempts by the authorities to discourage and disperse the protesters. And in mid-February, after police sharpshooters had opened fire, killing nearly 100 protesters, finally an agreement was reached on early elections and other compromise measures. And this was signed by President Yanukovych and opposition leaders, and brokered by representatives of several foreign states. That agreement, however, was never implemented because Yanukovych suddenly fled the country in the face of a spreading revolt throughout the entire country. As you remember, there were Maidans and evictions of administrators all over Ukraine. The power vacuum was filled by a chastened Verkhovna Rada, the National Assembly, which, with the wholehearted support now of parliamentarians, including those from Yanukovych's Party of Regions, voted overwhelmingly to remove him from office, to install an acting president, Alexander Turchinov, as a new premier, as an acting president, and a new premier, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, together with a new government made up of hitherto opposition politicians plus Maidan activists. And among other things, it restored the 2004 constitution, which provided for a parliamentary presidential, instead of the other way around, form of government, and set presidential elections for the 25th of May 2014. In sum, a revolution took place in Ukraine, although the Maidan demonstrators did not go home, despite the ouster of Yanukovych and his government being wary of the new authorities' commitment to radical change. Now, Ukraine is no match for Russia militarily, especially having given up its nuclear weapons in 1994 under the Budapest Agreement, in exchange for assurances of its security given by Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And war is not an option for Washington, so together with its allies, the United States is implementing various kinds of sanctions aimed at Moscow. However, by boldly casting international norms aside, with minimal cost to Russia, Putin has succeeded in shattering the whole post-war security regime, opening up a new era of unfathomable uncertainty in global politics. So Ukraine and the world will never be the same again. And this leaves much room for discussion. If the technical problems have been solved, I will turn over the microphone to Taras Kuzio.
I think there are four factors behind Putin's backing for annexation and invasion of the Crimea. The first one I would say is personal. I've never met Putin, but I get the impression that he often, it's a case of his heart ruling his head, particularly when it comes to issues such as relations with the West, the Americans, and to do with Ukraine. And the Euromaidan was the second time in 10 years that he had been personally humiliated. The Orange Revolution, the first, he had backed the wrong horse in both occasions, Yanukovych. The second view is a very different Russian view to international relations than the Ukrainian view. The Ukrainian view is that Ukraine should be able to integrate with the West, with Europe, and also have good relations with Russia. The Russian view, at least since Putin came to power, has been you're either with us or you're against us. There is no middle ground, Ukraine middle ground, of having integration and good relations with them. This was the old Kuchma line in the 1990s, was integration with Europe, cooperation with the CIUS, which is the majority Ukrainian opinion or viewpoint. But this is something that maybe Boris Yeltsin was acceptable to, but not Vladimir Putin. And so what's happened is that Putin's hostility to NATO enlargement, which was always around, has in recent years also become hostility to even EU enlargement, even though the EU is not offering Ukrainian membership, even hostility to EU enlargement light, which is the association agreement Ukraine signed last month. The third factor is Soviet Homo Sovieticus culture, which is there with many of the regional leaders in that part of the world, certainly there with Yanukovych and Putin. Yanukovych was absolutely convinced, and still is convinced, he won the 2004 elections, and that this was an American conspiracy to put Yushchenko into power. This is the same viewpoint today, that the Maidan is a Western-backed conspiracy revolution with something different to 2004. Now we have the added argument made by Yanukovych and Putin, and I think they really do believe this, that extremists and Nazis are the ones running the show on the ground. This was something that's told to me by Western ambassadors in Kiev, that they really do believe this. It's obviously contradicted by reality on the ground. For example, one of the Sotny, the company of 100 people in one of the self-defense units, was actually a Jewish Sotnya, led by 5 ex-members of the Israeli Defense Forces. And of the 102 who were killed or murdered, 3 were Jews, 2 were Georgians, 1 Belarusian, and 2 Armenians. I think the fourth factor is something historical and long and has always been around. It took Boris Yeltsin 3 years to come to Kiev to sign a treaty with Kuchma in the 90s, and that was with a more liberal democratic Russian president. And with Putin, there's a simple disrespect for Ukrainian independence. In 2008, during the NATO conference, our summit in Bucharest, he told NATO leaders already then that Ukraine was an artificial state and that a big chunk of its territory had been given to it wrongly by the Soviet Union. And that's coupled with an unwillingness, a long-term unwillingness to recognize Crimea and Sevastopol as being within Ukraine's sovereignty. So that's the sort of I think the factors that were around. Why was Crimea lost? I mean, I think it's wrong to believe it just began now. We should go back to 2006. In 2006, that was the only occasion in Ukraine's independent history where it had a potential to become a member of NATO. Bush and Cheney, the president and vice president of the US, were pushing this very strongly. There was a lot of sympathy for the Orange Revolution in the West, but it failed, and Bush did not visit Ukraine in June of that year, primarily because Viktor Yushchenko found it more important to not let Tymoshenko into government than to support NATO membership. I'm happy to answer questions about that, but it was a major mistake. If Ukraine had entered a membership action plan in November of that year in Riga, as was the plan, today Ukraine might have been a member of NATO. A second factor has been the resurgence of Crimean Russian nationalists. These were groups that were pushed into the margins, were made irrelevant in the Crimea by President Kuchma. By the late 1990s, they were pretty marginal force and had no influence. In 2006, a alliance was forged through the brokered by Konstantin Zatulin, an advisor to Putin, between the party regions and Crimean Russian nationalists. And they received a majority in the Crimean parliament. And one of the parties in the for Yanukovych bloc, it was the party that is Sergei Aksyonov, the leader of the Crimea, his party called Russkie Yedinstvo, Russian Unity. And so the party regions in Yanukovych revived the fortunes of Crimean Russian nationalists. And in fact, what we've all missed is the fact that in the current Crimean parliament, 82 of the 100 seats are controlled by party regions, and they all voted for the Crimea's annexation. This was also seen, this alliance, in 2008 when the party regions, Crimean Russian nationalists and communists, voted to recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. From 2010, when Yanukovych had come to power, we also have what I've written about and described as the Putinization or Russianization of Ukraine's security forces. And this was especially seen in the SBU, the secret police, and in the military, but also, of course, in the prosecutor's office. A final point, I think, which has led to the loss of the Crimea has been very bad current Ukrainian leadership. I think it was a big mistake, and she may pay for this, Yulia Tymoshenko, to push to have her right-hand man, Alexander Turchinov, as the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament. And then he becomes de facto acting president until the elections in May, because he, well, firstly, he has less charisma than this pen. He, at least in the first weeks when he took that position, he dressed like a disco bouncer with a turtleneck under a jacket. He ties Tymoshenko, he has links going back to Lazarenko. He's not the person for a new Ukraine after the Euromaidan. What they should have chosen was a younger person, a female, say, equivalent of Yatsenyuk, who speaks English and who could have a presentable pro-European face. That was not Turchinov. And he was a disaster. He never tried to nip in the bud the attempts at separatism at the beginning when Aksyanov's people took control of parliament in the Crimea. And he never gave either of one orders. There should have been either of one order given to Ukrainian troops in the Crimea, either a strategic withdrawal of the navy to Odessa and troops to Kherson, or the right for them to reply with weapons in a defensive action if they are attacked or if their bases are attacked. Neither order was given, and so we had chaos. And we possibly have had the loss of the Ukrainian navy to the Russians here. So it's, you know, the loss of the Crimea can be blamed across across the entire Ukrainian spectrum. Now, what about East Ukraine? Will there be an invasion? I think that in the first half of March, there was a very strong possibility. This is when the Kiev Post had this headline, which I never thought I would ever see. And it certainly probably was something like 70-80 in favor and 20-30 not. I think Putin hoped to create violence in southern and eastern Ukraine, maybe against Russian speakers, to get mass protests, and then these protesters on the streets would call for Russia to intervene to protect them against the fascists in Kiev. That didn't work for a variety of reasons. I think Putin misunderstands eastern and southern Ukraine. He often confuses ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. And he also was unable to get large numbers on the streets. In fact, opinion polls show that only about 5% of Ukrainians support the Crimea being taken over by Russia. So he wasn't able to implement his strategic plan, which may have led to a Russian intervention. Nevertheless, the Russian forces are still on the border. They are applying pressure. Putin would love to derail the presidential elections, because once you have a newly elected president who is seen as legitimate throughout Ukraine and recognized by the West, that means that Yanukovych can no longer claim he's the legitimate president of Ukraine. He also, I think, has failed because he's mobilized patriotism in Ukraine, including amongst Russian speakers. There was a quote from a Russian speaker in The Economist, and I'll quote it. Denis Shevlyakov said, I quote, "I dodged military service in the Soviet Union. I never thought I would volunteer to fight for Ukraine." And I think that is something that Putin is unable to understand. When you're near the Maidan, when you're on the Maidan, when you're on the Khreshchatyk, you hear Russian, including amongst the self-defense units, as much as you hear Ukrainian. So we've had violence imported from Russia in three ways. Today there was a press conference in Kiev where it was declared that something like 30 FSB, the Russian Domestic Intelligence Service, which also operates throughout the CIUS, in December and January came to Ukraine to help supervise and plan the so-called anti-terrorist operation, where together with the Alpha anti-terrorist unit of the SBU and the specialist unit in the Berkut to shoot protesters. Secondly, we've had some violence in the Crimea. At least 1 or 2 Ukrainian soldiers have died, and a Tatar was found tortured and murdered. And thirdly, we have ongoing Russian attempts at covert operations. Every day we hear of Russian units being apprehended with weapons and explosives throughout the country. In the last week, they've been in Lviv, Kiev, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Kharkiv. These are so-called political tourists. I don't know whether this, in international law, would be classified as a declaration of war. It's certainly a non-declaration of war. I mean, Russia hasn't declared war, but is in fact pursuing war. Where this will go is anybody's guess. Russia, Bogdan Harasimov has already talked about the sanctions. I won't go into that. Certainly Russia doesn't have international support. It's lost that. Only 10 UN members supported Russia in a vote this last week. Within the former Soviet Union, only Belarus and Armenia backed Russia. In Latin America, the typical left-wing anti-American countries such as Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And of course, these exemplar countries of democracy, Zimbabwe, Syria, Sudan, and North Korea. The big question is, will Putin's appetite stop the Crimea? Will he move into East Ukraine? Or will he maybe even also look at Russian-speaking enclaves in Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, and maybe even Brighton Beach, who knows? Certainly, in Latvia, you have more Russian speakers than in Ukraine. Latvia has something like 50% of Russian speakers. And you will hear Russian more in Riga than you do in Kiev. I think that Putin had a great opportunity to do what he did. There was regime change, chaos. Ukraine's security forces were in disarray. That gave him the perfect opportunity. What's not clear is why he chose to annex the Crimea and not adopt the same policies he's adopted in Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, which is to freeze conflicts and use those frozen conflict regions as a way to apply pressure on Ukraine. The fact that Crimea has now gone to Russia means Russia's lost a point of potential influence over Ukraine. And I wrote an article a few weeks ago where I said Russia gains Crimea and loses Ukraine. I think the other factor which Putin's undermined is his own policies, which have been to oppose the interference in foreign countries, to protect the sovereignty of countries. He very much was critical of the United States allegedly interfering in Syria, for example, in Iraq and elsewhere. Well, he's done that in Ukraine. And he came to power on the platform of supporting territorial integrity in Chechnya. And well, he's now a separatist himself. What do Ukrainian opinion polls say? Well, they all say things which Putin doesn't like. For example, I've already mentioned, only 5% of Ukrainians actually support the transfer of the Crimea or the annexation of the Crimea to Russia. Only 5%. 77 to 85% in different opinion polls oppose it, and they support the Crimea staying in Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, it's only 2%, for example. Southern Ukraine is a bit more, 19%. But it shows you to what degree that move by Russia is not even getting support in the east. 77% of Ukrainians condemn Russia's military invasion. 91% in western central Ukraine, and even 65 in the south and 55 in the East Ukraine. So even there you have criticism of Russia. Federalism that Russia continually talks about has always had minority support. It has zero support amongst the elites, and amongst the population in general, only about 10%. Prior to the Russian invasion of Crimea, support for union with Russia had very limited support in the West and Center, not surprising, 1 to 5% there. Even in the East, it only had 26%, so not a majority. In the South, 19%. Even in the Crimea, prior to the invasion, we're talking earlier this year, there was only 41% in favor of union of Ukraine with Russia. So not the 97% that allegedly was found in the referendum, or the 1 to 6% that was allegedly in Sevastopol. What I think we can thank Putin for is increasing support for NATO inside Ukraine. The support for NATO has now returned to levels found in the 1990s. So we now have a third of Ukrainians, as we had then, in support of NATO membership, about a third against, and about sort of the rest undecided. And usually in this case, I would think the undecideds will probably go more towards the support. So it's ironic that Putin has not only pushed Ukraine westwards in terms of the EU, but also in terms of NATO issues. I'll just now go talk about the elections and how this impacts upon the elections. Well, Ukraine has to get through 2 to 3 years of numerous multiple crises. It has an economic and financial crisis. The previous regime stole the cupboard bare. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk talks about something like 70 billion was stolen dollars. And we also have political issues to deal with this year, changing the constitution, and 3 elections, Kiev city elections, presidential and pre-term parliamentary. Unfortunately, at least with the presidential, and maybe with the parliamentary it'll be different, but and with the Kiev city it'll be different, but with the presidential we don't have any evidence of the influence of the Euromaidan or of new faces coming up. Vitaly Klitschko was the only really new face, and he's betrayed his voters. He traveled to Vienna this week together with Petro Poroshenko, where gas tycoon Dmytro Firtash persuaded him to drop his candidacy in favor of Poroshenko. What it should have happened is the opposite, that Poroshenko should have dropped it in favor of Klitschko. And it's surprising that they did this and got Firtash's endorsement, because he's on bail in Vienna, awaiting deportation to the United States to stand trial, and the Department of Justice of the US unveiled the criminal charges against Firtash yesterday. So what we have, therefore, is in some ways like a time machine, a return to 2005 with the 2 main candidates in the elections coming up on May 25th, Yulia Tymoshenko and Petro Poroshenko. It's bizarre at this stage that Poroshenko has such high ratings. I think that's a consequence of Tymoshenko not really starting her campaign really yet. It's also bizarre, it's partly because Ukrainians want to see a new face when actually Poroshenko isn't such a new face. He's actually one of the biggest chameleons in Ukrainian politics, and the word flip-flop was probably invented for him. He is somebody who came into parliament in 1998 in the Social Democratic Party of Ukraine, which was headed by Viktor Medvedchuk. He then left in the Ukrainian parliament to create his own faction, and a lot of this is on the Melnichenko tapes, where he asked Kuchma for money to bribe deputies to move to his faction called Solidarity. He then becomes, in 2000-2001, a founding member of the Party of Regions. Everybody forgets this. He hopes actually to become the leader, and he doesn't become a leader. Azarov actually becomes a leader, and Azarov is a friend of Poroshenko. They are close friends right the way through to the present, and hence why Poroshenko joined the Azarov government in 2012. He fails to become leader of the Party of Regions, and then goes to Our Ukraine and heads Yushchenko's election campaign. From there, he becomes an ally of Viktor Yushchenko after he's elected. Petro Poroshenko is very prominent on the anti-Tymoshenko wing of our Ukraine. In 2005, as Secretary of the National Security Council, he plays a big hand in basically destroying the Orange Coalition in September. And then the following year, because he refuses to stand aside for Alexander Moroz, the socialist leader, to become Speaker of Parliament, the Orange Coalition disintegrates, and Viktor Yanukovych unexpectedly comes back as Prime Minister. He then supports various grand coalitions between our Ukraine and Tymoshenko, and I don't think has a great reputation that will come out. If Klitschko had remained a candidate, Tymoshenko would have had a far more difficult time winning the elections against Klitschko, because he is the only new face amongst them. But I think she'll have a far easier time, especially bringing out this biography, if she faces Poroshenko, as I suspect, in the second round. Tymoshenko, of course, has her own demons, the links in the past, but this is in the 1990s, to Lazarenko. But at least since 2001, her politics have been pretty clear-cut. She's been on the radical, some say populist wing of anti-elite, anti-oligarch Ukrainian politics. She has some things to explain about the 2009 gas contract, but I believe that was as much the fault of Viktor Yushchenko as of her. I'm surprised a little that there isn't much sympathy about her time in jail, 2.5 years in jail. But one of the factors that's going to work against her is that she doesn't seem to have used that time very productively in adapting to the new Ukraine. There's a different Ukraine today than when she went to prison in 2010. So after seeing the candidates that are available, or the main candidates for Ukraine's presidential elections, I think, and because of past history, I would actually now argue that it's time for Ukraine to move to a full parliamentary system, because you're always going to have, unfortunately, old hats coming up and pushing out new faces. You're always going to have people betraying voters, like Tihipko 4 years ago, or Klitschko now. And unfortunately, in a presidential election, it's usually one side, either West Ukraine or East Ukraine, wins, and then they believe that they should take everything. It's winners take all, which is not good for the unity of the country. Whereas a parliamentary system, it means that no political party dominates parliament, and there's usually an importance of compromise. How much time do I have left? What now? No. Okay.
Well, how much did they give you?
I'll just do a conclusions then. Let me just give a few conclusions. And this is kind of observations more than conclusions. Firstly, everything that I wrote and a few other people wrote and said about Yanukovych and the party regions has come true, and even worse. The ties to organized crime, the thuggish and criminal behavior, and how they were very different from the previous Ukrainian leaders, who were either from the Komsomol, the Communist Youth League, or from the senior levels of the Communist Party, the nomenklatura. This has been reflected in the looting of Ukraine, to a degree even worse in the 1990s, and to the Russianization or Putinization of the security forces, and of course the deaths, the killings. Where you have the Kiev Post with headlines like this, which you can see. This is the first Ukrainian leader since the Stalin era that's been accused of murder in this degree. An example of this was news today that one party region's MP, Yuri Yanakivsky, who was a organized crime leader from the 1990s, he was allegedly involved in 40 murders, was the one supervising the vigilante thugs during the Euromaidan that were involved in abductions, torture, and killings. So, I mean, what happened, the murders, the deaths of 102 people, were in fact a reflection of who had come to power. And therefore, But it was something that very few people wanted to actually believe in. I think what's another observation I would make is that Ukraine has to end maybe the Euromaidan and the terrible crisis in Ukraine will lead to the reforms that have been put off for too long. Ukraine has always been talked about as a country muddling along. There's no more really, Ukraine cannot afford to muddle along anymore. And that's especially with the paramount need to reform law enforcement, as we saw during the Yanukovych era. Just to compare, Britain, my own country, Britain and Ukraine. Britain has 63 million people, Ukraine 48. Compare and contrast the law enforcement. Ukraine has 300,000 policemen. Britain has 120,000. Ukraine has 18,000 military uniformed prosecutors. Britain has 9,000. The SBU and the Foreign Intelligence Service have 34,000 personnel. Britain has combined 6,000, MI5, MI6. Canada's CIUS has 2,000. These are overblown, incompetent, and corrupt and violent institutions that severely need downsizing, I would say in the case of the prosecutor's office, even closing and reforming. And you can see that how this has been successful in the case of the Ukrainian military, which was downsized from 800,000 soldiers in 1991 to 170,000 today. And that's after 20 years of cooperation through NATO's Partnership for Peace program. The Ukrainian military, to its credit, twice in one decade, the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, refused to participate in repression and get involved in shooting protesters. I think another observation I would make is that it was wrong for certain, I would say, Western scholars and journalists to over-focus on West Ukraine and West Ukrainian nationalism. What the Crimean invasion has shown is that the most xenophobic region of Ukraine has been the Crimea. It's a mini Soviet Union similar to the Transnistria frozen conflict in Moldova. You have very few, I would say, Holocaust deniers amongst the far right in Ukraine. What you do have, though, amongst the Crimean Russian nationalists like Aksyonov, the communists, and the party regions, is deniers of the Tatar genocide of 1944, when half of them died en route to Central Asia. And also, I think what this has been shown is how Jewish organizations and individuals in Ukraine have rallied to defend Ukraine's reputation as a bastion of tolerance. After all, Jews are Russian speakers, so Putin is allegedly wants to protect them. And they have attacked, there was a very big, you can find it on the internet, very long open letter to Vladimir Putin signed by about 240 Jewish leaders who said that there isn't a problem of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, the problem of anti-Semitism is in Russia. And I would also point out that not everything is always what it seems in Ukraine. And that's people like me who follow it see that. For example, the only observers that Vladimir Putin could find to come to the Crimean referendum were from the far right and Nazi groups in the European Union, such as the Jobbik government in Hungary. So it's ironic that Putin is complaining about alleged fascists in Kiev when, in fact, it's Nazis and the far right from Europe who are coming to give the thumbs up to the Crimean referendum. It's also the case that many Russian Nazis and far-right individuals have been the ones coming to the Crimea and eastern and southern Ukraine to support the alleged separatists. And I think linked to that, it's what's surprising and what's come out of this is how Russian nationalism, at least contemporary Russian nationalism, is not only xenophobic and Nazi and anti-Semitic, but also has very strong ties to organized crime. Sergei Aksyonov, the Crimean leader, his criminal name is Goblin, from when in the 1990s he was involved in the Salem criminal group in the Crimea. The Salem criminal group in the Crimea has strong ties to the criminal groups in Donetsk. My final point is, I think an observation I found is mindset. I think it's just what I think is, I've noticed it's been very difficult for the Anglo-Saxon and liberal mindset to really understand Putin, to understand Yanukovych, and how they lie, how they're deceitful, and how we shouldn't believe the kind of things that they say. I was told by Western ambassadors in early November in Kiev that Yanukovych had become convinced and pro-European. How wrong they were. I found it very difficult to argue about Yanukovych's criminal background to even Western and Canadian academics right the way through to very recently. Just related to that, a final point is how to show you how the Western mindset actually confuses things here, is how we export our stereotypes to the East. I call it the Boratization of politics. For example, corruption. There's no question that Ukraine is corrupt. It's allegedly the most corrupt country in Europe. At the same time, where does that corrupt money go? It usually ends up in Western Europe, Britain, for example, Austria, Monaco, Cyprus, Liechtenstein, and offshore zones. So the corruption is two-sided. It's where it's made and then where it's sent. So I don't think the European Union has a strong face to argue a corruption in Ukraine when it's very willing to accept the billions of dollars from this corrupt region into its own countries without due diligence. And finally, before we condemn
is this your final?
The extreme right and anti-Semitism in Ukraine, you will like this. Last year, there were 27 so-called incidents of anti-Semitism in Ukraine, which includes newspaper articles. In the same year, 2013, there were 600 to 800 incidents of anti-Semitism in Britain and France, and 1,300 in Germany. Populist nationalists and Nazi groups are far more popular in the EU than they are in Ukraine. Oleg Chernovych would never be able to win the presidential election in Ukraine. So when we look at the far right, we should also compare this to how it's a far more popular political persuasion in the EU than it is in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taras. David, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to talk. Is this microphone on? Yeah, can you? I wanted to talk about Russia's media wars and Russian plans for Ukraine. Ukraine seems to be losing a media war with Russia, one that offers parallel views of the Russian takeover of Crimea without a shred of common ground between them. Moreover, the Russian propaganda campaign, and that I think is probably an accurate term, has been quite relentless. So I thought I'd try today to figure out what are the main facets and goals of this Russian media campaign during the Euromaidan crisis and the invasion of Crimea. First of all, the Euromaidan is portrayed in two ways. As a right-wing coup d'etat, which overthrew an elected president, incidentally not a president that Vladimir Putin really has had any time for, and as a foreign-inspired uprising subsidized by and supported openly by the United States. Second, Euromaidan posed a direct threat to Russian speakers in Ukraine, as witnessed by the immediate, albeit temporary, abrogation of the language law guaranteeing Russians the right to use their own language if they make up more than 10% of the population, in areas, of course, where they live. Further, the interim cabinet, which required at least the tacit support of protesters, excluded, for the most part, representatives from eastern and southern Ukraine. The reports omitted the salient fact, though, that the Regents Party and the Communist parties, which predominate in those areas in elections, declined to join this new interim cabinet, as did in fact the Udar party of Vitaly Klitschko. Much was made of the fact as well that the party Svoboda had significant representation as high as the level of deputy prime minister. Russian news agencies have declared openly that Russian speakers in Ukraine faced persecution by a government which wished to remove Ukraine from its natural position, that of a Russian ally, and ensure that it was firmly in the orbit of the European Union and ultimately NATO. Third, as a response to the fears of local inhabitants, Russian forces took over Crimea in late February and later rejected the existing treaties signed with Ukraine on the peninsula in 1954, 1997 and 2010. In turn, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, by which Russia, the United States, Finland and Britain guaranteed Ukraine's security after the country gave up its nuclear weapons, was no longer considered valid. Russian sources point to the emphatic results of the referendum that followed, one in which Russian soldiers and naval personnel took part in the voting, as evidence that the return of Crimea to Russia redressed an old error on the part of the Soviet leadership when headed by Malakov, Voroshilov and Khrushchev. The media have also embellished events with a series of lies and distortions that would make Pinocchio blush. Ukrainian sources were blacked out or jammed throughout the referendum period in Crimea. The fabrications include the fiction that in fact Russia never invaded Crimea at all, and that the forces there were actually local volunteers in uniforms without any markings, even though in fact the weapons they used were clearly of Russian origin. Fourth, Moscow is insisting, backed again by the media, that Ukraine has to adopt a federalist system in its new constitution. In other words, there has to be some form of autonomy in areas that contain significant numbers of Russian speakers. The areas in question include the following regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Odessa, and perhaps Dnipropetrovsk and Kirovohrad. In order to support that position, Russian mercenaries crossed the border into the Donbass and took over government buildings, fomented trouble in other regions, and the Russian army occupied a gasworks in the Kherson region. More protests have already been scheduled for 4th and 5th of April, which is tomorrow, of course, and Saturday, in the Novoazovsk district of Donetsk. The relative apathy of the response today has delayed a direct military intervention. So instead, some 80,000 Russian troops amassed at various points on Ukraine's borders, ready to strike in specific areas, with field hospitals at the ready. But they need to create further evidence that Russian enclaves really require their support. One goal appears to be the Finlandization of Ukraine. That is, the maintenance of a sovereign state that does not interfere in any way with the foreign policy of a larger and more powerful neighbor. This was, of course, the way that Finland supposedly survived during the Cold War, with a policy of non-alignment and neutrality with Russia. But Finlandization may be the minimum target. The fifth point is that President Putin has initiated talks with the United States at both the presidential and secretarial of state levels. And here the situation may have been abetted by the unguarded comments of the US president. Russian media insist that Americans have already acknowledged the justification of the establishment of a federal system in Ukraine. By discussing it, Americans have conceded the right, implicitly at least, of one sovereign state to have the right to make key decisions about the structure and makeup of another. When John Kerry met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in The Hague last week, Lavrov commented as follows after the meeting: "Ukraine cannot function as a unified state, and it should be a loose federation of regions that choose their own economic model, language, and religion." Moreover, President Obama stated openly that a military response to the Russian annexation of Crimea is not and has never been on the table. That statement may have been a wise one in terms of world tension or international tension, but it certainly served at the same time as a green light to Putin and a consensus that Ukraine today lies firmly within the Russian sphere of interest. The United States has responded in part by offering funds for the expansion of Radio Liberty's service to Ukraine, an effort to provide alternative perspectives to the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. NATO has also responded belatedly and slowly, and without any commitment to defend Ukraine, which of course is not a member of the alliance. The Russian media has also, confusingly but cleverly, compared its actions with those of the Western powers in Kosovo, that is, in creating a new state of Kosovo in the middle of Europe, as well as the bombing of Belgrade by NATO in 1999. The rationale here seems to be, well, we were not the first to make changes to borders that have been in place since the end of the Second World War. And Russia has been retreating from NATO for far too long, especially since 2004, when the NATO alliance expanded eastward and took in Poland and the Baltic states. Because all those new states that became NATO members previously had also just become members of the European Union, so the NATO alliance was added to this agreement. Sixth, the goal of the Russian authorities is to undermine in every possible way the credibility of the temporary government of Ukraine. It began with a humiliating takeover of Ukrainian bases in Crimea, the portrayal in great detail of scandals pertaining to the right sector movement, including the recent shootout in central Kiev and its eviction from the Dnipro Hotel, that is, its main headquarters in the city. But it's expressly stated that the curbing of right-wing forces in Ukraine has simply not gone far enough. The Russian sides have also focused on the torchlight procession to mark the birth of Stepan Bandera during the Euromaidan events on January the 1st, 2014. And also the association of leaders of the main opposition parties, Batькivщина and Udar, with the opposition forces of Svoboda. And they've attributed the slaughter of innocents in the Maidan, of which Taras spoke, directly with the opposition forces. The impression given to the average Russian viewer or radio listener is that Ukraine today is in the hands of cutthroats and fanatics, most of whom affiliate themselves with extreme nationalism, if not outright Nazism. In this way, Russia has every right to defend its own interests and to protect fellow nationals and Russian speakers in fraternal Ukraine. Is the campaign working? And what will the future bring? It has certainly been successful in two respects. The conquest of Crimea took place without a single Russian casualty, and the Ukrainian government appeared powerless to offer any response, completely bewildered by the events. Its European friends and the United States were similarly stymied, offering only financial support to the beleaguered government and imposing sanctions and travel bans, mostly futile in the short term, both on the Russian Federation and its leaders. Incidentally, Vladimir Putin is not banned from travel. The Russian president was subjected to wide criticism from many quarters of the Russian electorate before the last election. But he's now seen his popularity soar to over 80% in opinion polls. Russians, in short, seem to have accepted his reasoning and to be firmly behind their president. In truth, they only hear one voice. Television viewers in Ukraine, as of yesterday, could access up to 69 Russian channels. In Russia, also yesterday, it was impossible to find a single Ukrainian channel anywhere. So one can speak of a complete blackout of the Ukrainian perspective of events in the Russian Federation. What is the ultimate goal? The answer seems to be the reduction of Ukrainian authority to a kind of rump regime, with the undermining of all those regions that possess significant numbers of sympathizers or Russian speakers. Ideally, I think, the Ukrainian presidential election would be delayed or would not take place at all, so that Turchinov and Yatsenyuk can remain in power for the immediate future. Theoretically, the Donbass and other regions could follow Crimea into Russian control. Even an incursion into Odessa region might also consolidate the breakaway Republic of Transnistria, which has been in place for more than 2 decades. But while using the resources of the media for his own advantage, Putin is also following a dictated by Stalin more than 70 years ago. And I quote now, "Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. It cannot be otherwise." End of Stalin speaking. Will the Russians cross the Ukrainian border, that is, the border of mainland Ukraine? Well, it's possible. How else does one explain the presence not only of tanks and artillery? One is that Putin's adventures in Ukraine are an attempt to deflect criticism from problems at home, and the increasing corruption and authoritarianism of the Putin presidency. Also, it seems almost inevitable that Russia must suffer in the long term from the costs of the occupation, the maintenance of such a large army on the borders of Ukraine, sanctions on its main companies, and not least the targeting of individual oligarchs and revelations about their financial holdings, not only in Russia, but also worldwide. The chief oligarch in the Russian Federation, though, is Vladimir Putin. His net worth is estimated something in the area of $48 billion. I don't know how it was counted, by the way. I'm simply quoting the source there. A fact that detracts from the image he prefers to propagate of a populist politician who understands the needs of the average Russian worker or farmer. Russia's actions have also prompted responses from other neighbors, most significantly Belarus, a virtual dictatorship for the past 20 years under Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko has cast off his previous position as a neutral in this conflict. While stressing the need to continue trading with Ukraine and to keep the borders open, he has criticized Euromaidan and declared that in the current situation, Belarus, quote, will always be with Russia. In turn, as Taras said, he was also one of those who voted against the UN resolution criticizing Russia's intervention in Crimea. In short, in contrast to the response to the Russian invasion of Georgia 6 years ago, when Lukashenko refused to recognize the breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, he has clearly accepted a position today as a junior partner of Russia. And why? Most likely because of the fear of a Russian invasion had he acted otherwise. In this particular confrontation, Russia has made it clear that neutrality can never be an option. The frequently made analogies of Putin's Russia with Nazi Germany in the Western media are understandable, but ultimately they are irrelevant. As is, unfortunately, Ukraine's decision to sign a political association agreement with the European Union as the aftermath of the failed Vilnius summit. All that really matters is whether the West, which essentially means NATO and the United States, is prepared to bolster Ukraine's military prowess. Putin's Russia, which I would not equate with earlier versions of the independent Russian state since 1991, has the will and the means to change the map of Europe and reduce Ukraine perhaps to its right bank or even further. Independence would then become meaningless because the country would be unable to defend itself or cover its losses. However, propaganda today is the key aspect of this conflict. As a result, a war could be won without actually fighting. And I would say that probably my own personal perspective is that most likely what Putin wants is, again, the Finlandization of Ukraine. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I think we'll go to questions from the audience, and then we can give the speakers a chance to wrap up after that. Well, who's going to go first here? I wonder if the speakers could tell us anything about the economic side of this whole situation. Taras?
Well, the economy is in recession. Foreign investors had begun leaving Ukraine the last few years, so there's a dearth of foreign investment coming in. But most importantly, there's a terrible financial crisis. The budget is empty. And this week, the hryvnia dropped to its lowest ever level, close to 11 hryvnia to $1. And Ukraine has signed a new agreement with the IMF. We'll see if Ukraine can implement the IMF agreement. No Ukrainian government has ever implemented an IMF agreement fully. Because they usually have implemented the first stage of stabilization, which is easy, relatively speaking, but the structural reforms, the second part, are highly unpopular, and few governments have wanted to do them. Maybe on this occasion there's no option, but Arseniy Yatsenyuk is in many ways a kamikaze prime minister in terms of what he has to do, but there's simply no option. The other side to this is Russia's trade blockade of Ukraine, which will affect industries in East Ukraine, of course, and lead to unemployment, and the whole question of energy relations. It's absolutely bizarre that Ukraine can import cheaper Russian gas from Germany than it can get from Russia. And this is not something new. Russia refused to reduce or to change the 2009 gas contract price for Yanukovych until he signed up to be Putin's man in November of last year. And Russia, in the last few days, has raised the price of gas for Ukraine up to so-called nearly $500. The price, which is going to add on a huge amount to the Ukrainian budget deficit and to the import costs. This is going to lead to further US sanctions against Russia, because that was one of the demands that the US said to Russia, not to use energy pressure. But that's going to be a major problem. Now, there is two sides to that. 60% of Russian gas is exported to the West through Ukraine. So any disruption hurts Russia as much as it hurts Ukraine. But it's a major problem that many European countries are highly dependent on Russian energy sources. And you cannot overcome that very quickly in the short term. That's something more medium to long term.
And David, what about Russia? Can Putin afford economically this military territorial expansion indefinitely, or how much longer?
Well, it kind of depends on on what territorial expansion would mean. If the expansion takes in more areas of Ukraine, or if it takes in Transnistria, or if it takes in Latvia, I mean, this is all, I mean, complete supposition. We don't know this, then yes, it would be almost impossible, I think, currently. Russia is very much a petro-state. It's been a petro-state, I would say, even in the Soviet period since around the 70s and 80s. That is, it relies on the exports of oil and gas for its revenues to an extraordinary degree that would be outrageous, I think, to anyone other than the people who live in this province. Because we basically have a similar kind of economic strategy, so that when the oil and gas prices, which are obviously tied anyway, when they go up, everybody's happy, and we get bailouts, we get $400 to every member of the province. When they go down, everybody's in crisis, and the university starts making cuts in every direction. Of course, having Thomas Lukashuk around as well would help. But Russia has never really diversified, so I think it has this weakness, you know, that it's not really in a position to develop as a major global power under the present system. It could obviously do more, and it has a lot of resources, but at the moment Russia needs some modernization, I would say, particularly in its coal fields and steelworks, just as Ukraine does as well. It's a big economy, but I certainly don't think it can afford military expansion on any kind of major scale.
Okay, yes?
Here. This could be a question for either of you, but is it possible that if Putin's expansion tendencies are halted by Western pressure, do you think that this could be the end of Putin, or is he going to stick around for a while? Can he afford, domestically, can he afford to lose this?
You can go first, Taras.
Taras?
I don't see how Putin can lose. He's got 80% support. This is fantastic for Putin. The Russian public on the whole have bought into it. I mean, one reason being, as David's pointed out, the massive Russian propaganda blitz. Since the Crimean crisis began, the last vestiges, even on the internet, of Russian media freedom have been closed. This really is a totalitarian state in terms of media domination, in terms of one angle. So I don't see how this can hurt Putin at all. The problem is that his appetite is whetted, and I think the question is, where will he go next? He's highly unpredictable. Russia's always been interfering in the Crimea in a variety of ways. 2 Russian diplomats were expelled from Ukraine in the summer of 2009. But to go this step further, an actual annexation of Crimea was unexpected. So Putin, in that sense, is unpredictable, and I don't think Western sanctions will have the desired effect. I mean, they will hurt Russia, but for Crimeans, for example, they believe anyway that they will get Russian pensions and Russian salaries, which are higher than Ukrainian. And
they've already been promised.
May be the case.
By Medvedev.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be the case that lots of Russian tourists will come to the Crimea, because Russian tourists go to the same places as Ukrainian tourists. I know nobody in Kiev who goes on holiday to the Crimea. They go to Egypt, Turkey, Croatia, Thailand. They don't go to the Crimea. It's terrible service and high prices. So they're going to be disappointed there. But the Crimea has always been a backwater. I mean, it is a backwater in terms of it's highly reliant on Ukraine for fresh water and for energy, for electricity. So, and the gas supply to the Crimea comes from Ukraine. So Ukraine does have the potential to cut that off. But I don't see how this can really hurt Putin, certainly in the short term. And the only country where politicians are calling for military support to be provided to Ukraine in terms of defensive support, like anti-aircraft, anti-tank weapons, is really the United States. That's not happening in Canada, and it's not happening in Western Europe.
David?
Yeah, I would agree that invading Crimea has actually done Putin a lot of good. And that's not surprising, because any politician who can conduct a small, victorious war is going to see a rise in popularity. And this is why I stress that the zero casualties is the most significant thing.
Margaret Thatcher, Falklands.
That was my next sentence. I'd actually just written that down in front of me here, yeah. I don't know what to say now. Yeah, so the problem is that if at some point people start firing back, which could happen if he goes into the Donbass, and casualties start to mount, as they did after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a long, drawn-out war, then this becomes a big drag on popularity. Initially there as well, in December 1979, the invasion of Afghanistan was not an unpopular thing. The Soviet army went straight to the palace, killed the president, they took over quite smoothly, but then it went on and on and on and turned into a long kind of guerrilla campaign. That is the sort of thing that is going to be a drag on the Russian economy. And in terms of the sanctions, I think they will have an impact sooner or later, but it might take 5 to 10 years before you really see it. Putin's got no one who is challenging him for power right now. The only one possibly is perhaps Navalny, and he's been targeted every time he puts in a public appearance. So there isn't much of an opposition in Russia. The parliament is completely under control of the presidency. In fact, Putin's party has a majority in the parliament. The only opposition in Russia today is from the communists. And the communists are probably not too averse to the idea of Ukraine becoming significantly closer to the Russian Federation, at least given historical precedent.
Yeah, I'd like to just a couple of comments on the rise of Putin's popularity. And David, you mentioned the analogy or the reference to the Falklands War. But also when if you look at Hitler's popularity, I mean, it went up tremendously as well when he entered the Rhineland and when he annexed Austria, when Sudetenland came back. So there are, I mean, I agree that one can't make these blind, let's say, comparisons, but certainly some of the references to Hitler's actions in even World War II, I think, are relevant because of the ethnic card that Hitler was playing at the time, and Putin's using the same card right now. So the analogies are certainly there that one can make reference to. I think it's valid. But one of the reasons I think that Ukraine, I don't agree with the Finlandization part of or the possibility, is because I think Putin has to go further than Finlandization. Finlandization would be something that he would accept with reluctance, perhaps. But I think that he's afraid of what I think Ukraine has the potential to be not just a thorn in the side, but an harbinger of his ultimate defeat and the ultimate transformation of Russia. Because if you look at the revolution in Ukraine, or the change, at least it has the potential to overcome, or at least to bring corruption and criminality of the elites under control. And if we look at Putin's regime, we see the Putin regime is very corrupt. It has very close ties to organized crime and to criminal structures, especially the FSB. And the anti-communist nature of the anti-Soviet nature of the Ukrainian revolution, I think, is clear, symbolized by the toppling of all of the Lenin monuments. Granted, it hasn't gone far into the east, but it has gone into the south and central Ukraine, certainly. And then, if you look at also the third aspect of the revolution, the anti-imperial, the nation-building aspect of it in Ukraine. Ukraine is weak, but certainly economically it's weak militarily, but certainly the consolidation, I think, of its society is stronger at least the willpower there for the time being is there, and Putin has, in fact, through his actions, I think, done a service to the Ukrainian nation-building project. So that's what I would argue.
Tarasa, did you want to respond to that?
Just one quick thing. I remember when I was last in Edmonton on January 30th that Bogdan Harasimu said to me over lunch something that relates to this issue of crime and of corruption and criminality. And he asked me the question over lunch, which I throw out here as well. Has there been an example in history of such a corrupt country as Ukraine overcoming its corruption? I don't know whether Bogdan remembers asking that question, but probably does. But it is certainly a point. Maybe we're aiming for Southern European levels, not Canadian levels of corruption. But certainly, this is a massive, massive task of Ukraine. To give you an example, Transparency International, the anti-corruption watchdog, ranks Ukraine as the most corrupt country in Europe. Heritage Foundation think tank ranks Ukraine as the worst country in Europe in terms of economic freedom. Ukraine's GDP is still only 3/4 of what it was in the Soviet Union in 1989. Ukraine's elites have squabbled over a small pie rather than letting the pie grow. And the World Bank ranks Ukraine very bad in terms of taxation and ease of doing business. The purchasing, to give an example of one reason why Crimeans, it wasn't just nationalism, it was also economics, wanted to go to Russia. The purchasing power parity for Ukraine is only 22% of that average in the European Union, and only 40% of the average of Russia. Belarus has a higher average wage than Ukraine. And Ukraine has one of the highest shadow economies in the world. Largest, sorry. It's about nearly 50% of GDP. And it's basically fixed. I mean, if the shadow economy is there for so long, it's basically a stable shadow economy. So to overcome all of that, especially at a time of crisis, especially, financial, economic, political, energy, is going to be a monumental task. I wish them luck. I hope that they at least start on the job, but you're in a far worse starting position in many ways than after the decade of transition under Kuchma, because you had the disintegration effects of the Yushchenko era and especially the asset stripping of the Yanukovych era. So, it's a massive undertaking to actually fight that corruption. You need political will from a president, and you need external support. Particularly the offer of EU membership was certainly instrumental in countries like Romania and Bulgaria, and in Greece, in at least attacking some of the corruption in the judicial and other parts of the system. Without a strong leader committed to fighting corruption, without external support from the European Union in the form of membership, it's going to be extremely difficult.
David?
Yeah, I don't like the analogy of Nazi Germany.
Agreed. Fully agreed.
No, I mean, my feeling is that, Vladimir Putin does not want to eliminate a nation from the face of the earth. What he wants...
That's debatable, isn't it?
Well, I'm giving my opinion now, obviously. I'm not saying everybody has to agree with it. What does he want to do? And I think, basically, Putin wants to redress what he thinks has been an imbalance in the fate of Russia politically for the last 20 years. The loss of an East European quasi-empire that was basically made up of communist regimes, the expansion of NATO, the loss, as he sees it, of neighboring states like the Baltics, all of which possess large numbers of ethnic Russians. In 1991, 25 million Russians lived outside the Russian Federation. The first one to draw attention to this was Boris Yeltsin. But no one would expect that Boris Yeltsin wanted to eliminate other nations or take over territory. Today, it's something like a strategic game that Putin is playing. And quite frankly, he's playing it very well. He's simply waiting for the response. If I do this, what move will the West do? How will it respond? The West has responded by saying, we're not going to respond. So, therefore, he can make the next move. It's not a question of occupation. I think it's more a question of strategy and how far you can go before someone stops you. You do this, there's no response. So why not do something else? And you put 80,000 troops around the border, nobody knows what he's going to do. That's the big question today. The biggest question in all this crisis is, what is Putin going to do next? And if that's the biggest question, then he succeeded at least in this first stage of whatever it is planning to do.
Yes.
Okay, so my question, it was mentioned earlier about Crimea basically becoming a part of the Russian Empire. So my question is, why didn't Putin just do what was done with South Ossetia and Abkhazia after the Georgian War and sort of have a referendum held there to make them into autonomous republics? Why is Crimea different? Why is there so much economic support going into Crimea? Like, they're building, I believe, a pipeline into Crimea. They're also giving all of the tax breaks to Crimea. So why is that so different from South Ossetia and Abkhazia? Thank you.
David?
I'm letting Teres go first for these questions, and then I'll second. All right?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different frozen conflicts in the region, and the closest equivalent would probably be Transnistria in Moldova, because that's also a Russian-speaking region. Ironically, the largest ethnic group is Ukrainians, but it's primarily Russian-speaking. And the region was part of the Ukraine in the interwar period. It was called the Moldovan Autonomous Soviet Republic inside Soviet Ukraine. So that could be a potential second place that could be annexed. But South Ossetia and Abkhazia are different because there are no Russian speakers there. These are national minority regions as part of Georgia, and they were regions that Russia maybe believed could be used as pressure points on then Saakashvili government to stop it joining NATO. The other similarity to Crimea is Nagorno-Karabakh, because Nagorno-Karabakh and a region of Azerbaijan was annexed, de facto annexed by Armenia. And I somehow don't think Armenians are going to give that back to Nagorno-Karabakh, give that back to Azerbaijan. So there has been one example, and Armenia was acting there as a Russian proxy with Russian weapons, and Armenia has joined the CIUS customs union. Now, Crimea is also different as well, because, and this is what makes it different for Ukrainians and for Russians. Crimea does not feature prominently in Ukrainian national identity or Ukrainian historical myths, whereas it's highly central to a lot of the mythology surrounding, for Russian history, Crimean War of the mid-19th century, and then Sevastopol during World War II. And so I would say in some ways Crimea or Sevastopol or both, this is sort of, I'm treading on historical issues here, is in many ways for Russians similar to how Serbs see Kosovo. So very emotional. And hence that also makes it different. The blind spot here is that Russia has always ignored, as I mentioned, the Crimean Tatar population, which is anything now between 15 and 20%. And they boycotted the referendum completely, and they do hate Russia and Russians to the same degree as the Chechens do, who were also ethnically cleansed in 1944 by Joseph Stalin.
We're running out of time.
So the Crimean Sevastopol is a blind spot.
Is that okay? I'm sorry, Taras, because there's still two more people to ask questions.
No, we're finished.
Yeah, I would just add to that Crimea became part of the Russian Empire in 1783. So it is a long tradition, really, of Russian control, and the belief that, in fact, this is a territory that legally, if you like, or historically belongs to Russia. Of course, it conveniently forgets 300 years of rule by the Tartars, but nevertheless, it does have a long tradition of Russian control. So the 1954 removal of Crimea from Russia was a historical accident. It made no difference at all in 1954, but by 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it suddenly became part of an independent Ukraine. So the idea is to try to get it back.
This question is for Taras. I was going to ask him whether he is going to ask Klitschko to reconsider the presidency.
That's impossible. Today was the last day of registration. I totally agree with you that it was a complete mistake. Klitschko should have stood his ground, told Firtash to shut up, and say, you're about to be sent to America to be put in jail. And he should have said to Poroshenko, you stand down in favor of me. It actually shows very badly on Klitschko, to be quite honest, because he would have represented the new face or the new Ukraine after the Maidan. Yes, he has lots of problems. He's not maybe up to the task, but that's just a question of advisors and people around him. But he gave up, and Poroshenko is a terrible substitute for Klitschko.
Very quickly.
Right.
So it's too late.
The Ukrainian military has to be reorganized, rearmed. They should at least have some sort of reasonable military of 100,000 that actually is capable of defending Ukraine. And do you see any possibility of major input by the US, NATO in that, particularly financial and in providing arms and in training?
Well, the training has been going on for 20 years as part of Partnership for Peace with NATO, and Ukraine has taken part in many foreign international peacekeeping operations under UN or NATO flags. It's impossible for us to know, because it's obviously a state secret, to what degree the equipment supplied or with the Ukrainian military is in good shape. I mean, Ukraine is a massive producer of weapons, even more than the USSR, but still is. And so there's no problem in supplying those weapons to the Ukrainian military. We just don't know to what degree it was kind of demoralized and de-equipped by, say, the Yanukovych administration or even earlier. I mean, there is strong support in the US, particularly on the Republican side, to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons. I do not know if that is being considered, and if it is considered, I'm sure it's going to be covertly done, not overtly. But there's also other ways to help. There's a way of particularly in beefing up the National Guard. Ukraine did have a National Guard between 1991 and 2000. Then President Kuchma abolished the National Guard and transferred it back to the Ministry of Interior. So thankfully that's been now reorganized. And the NATO and I think the US is supplying or will supply Ukraine with particularly very important intelligence. For example, on Russian troop movements. I'm sure that's taking place. So the training is there, but to what degree that will take a while to flow through. I'm not pessimistic about a Russian invasion, because I think if Putin does stupidly order his troops into eastern Ukraine, he'll have a situation far worse than Afghanistan. Russia will lose. It will not be able to fight a war in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, we'll have to cut it off with that.
If he thinks that the population will support him is wrong. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. This will have to be the last question because we have to vacate this room. I'm sorry.
Do either of you gentlemen believe that there's any realistic possibility that Crimea will be restored to Ukraine?
I'll give you my answer. No. I think it would be very difficult to do unless Russia voluntarily withdrew all its forces. And I don't think it's going to withdraw all its forces as long as it's so politically popular that Crimea has been, quote unquote, returned to Russia after more than 60 years. So I don't think that will happen. I mean, I always felt when I visited places like Sevastopol that there was a real feeling of being in a Russian city. I won't say that for all Crimea, but that particular city was more Russian than most places I visited in Russia. You know, you really did get that sentiment of a very strong national feeling. So I don't think they'll want to give it up, and I don't think there's any way to get it back. And you know, one of the things I was going to add to the last comments of Taras was that, you know, NATO is not really at its best right now. I mean, the first thing NATO needs to do is revamp itself.
It's past its best before date.
Yeah, and second, the next thing NATO will do is bolster its members of Baltic states, Poland, anywhere on the border with Ukraine. And then the third thing will be to look at the situation in Ukraine. So I think it will take some time and a lot of money.
Thank you. Taras, your response?
I think I'm going to be very provocative in answer to this question, which is my forte, and to say good riddance to the Crimea. And in this, I agree with the Ukrainian writer Yuri Andrukhovich, Mykola Rabchuk, and others who say Ukraine without the Crimea is far more likely to be able to integrate westwards. I just cannot, for example, imagine Ukraine joining NATO with the Crimea. Whereas without the Crimea, that's a possibility. The Crimea would have always been a drag on Ukraine going westwards. It already was de facto controlled by Russia, even before the annexation. And could you imagine if the Ukrainian government had annulled the 2010 agreement to extend the Sevastopol Black Sea Fleet agreement till 2042? Would Putin really have withdrawn the Black Sea Fleet? I don't think so. So, it's changed de facto because Russia's now controlling or has occupied and annexed the place, but Russia was controlling it before. What Putin's done is very foolish. He's taken away a potential pressure point on Ukraine, which he no longer now has. If Crimea had remained a frozen conflict inside Ukraine, like, say, Transnistria and Moldova, then that would have been, in some ways, better for Putin because he could have a point of influencing or pressuring Ukraine. That's now lost. To me, it's interesting that there wasn't the willpower in Kiev to fight the Crimea. And I saw that even on the Maidan in March when I was there talking to self-defense units. Even the nationalists thought, yes, we're going to fight for East Ukraine, but Crimea, no.
Thank you very much. Just before we wrap up, then, if I could share with you a couple of impressions that I have. One is to endorse Taras's point about the need for revolutionary change in personnel of the government. That without this, the changes that Ukraine desperately needs are going to be either delayed or never implemented. So I think he's made a very good point there. As far as advice for the Ukrainian government is concerned, I would give them two pieces of advice. First, you have to take government seriously. It's not just a giveaway of resources to your friends who are the ministers and the bureaucrats and so on. And secondly, I would say prepare for guerrilla warfare. And if you really need any lessons, just ask the Chinese. Mao Zedong on guerrilla warfare. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending and for your attention and for your questions, and also to thank the two speakers, Taras and David. Give them a big hand, please. Thanks very much, Taras. See you next time.
Bye. Bye.